wedding planning friends, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thanks so much for clicking on my video. I'm Emily Summer. I'm a wedding planner based in Montana, and I make weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice. So today I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about something that I touched on a couple weeks back in a wedding catering video, and we're going to chat all about having food trucks at your wedding. Okay, so we've seen food trucks at weddings start to become a little bit more popular in recent years, and here in Montana it's still not a super popular catering style at weddings, but I do know in other parts of the country and of the world this is something that people like to have at their wedding. So there's a lot that goes into the consideration of having food trucks at your wedding, and a lot of little details to think through and decide if this is a viable option for you and your wedding, and if it makes sense, if it fits in your budget, and all of that fun stuff. So first of all, the first thing to think about if you're considering having food trucks at your wedding, or if you're wondering if that's something that might work for you, is consider the location. So if you're having a wedding venue, or if you're having your wedding at a wedding venue that is maybe like up a long, windy, gravel, not paved road like a lot of venues are here in Montana, it might be difficult for a food truck to even get up there. Additionally, if there's, thinking through where a food truck might park at your venue. So if there's a large parking lot that is nearby where the reception space will be and where your guests will be sitting and eating, that might be a viable option for you. If your venue does not have parking nearby, or if it has parking maybe at the bottom of a hill and then you have to take a transit to get up to the actual ceremony and reception space, or if it's a really small space, or if there's just really not a parking option, this is something to think about, because with a food truck, they have to park somewhere. So keep that in mind when you're thinking through this and deciding if food trucks are even an option for you. Next is timing. So this is the most important factor and often the biggest con of food trucks is the timing of everything. So for your dinner, when you have dinner at your wedding, you really don't want this time to go past an hour. Typically what I do is like 30 to 45 minutes is how long it should take for everybody to get food. So whether that's a buffet line, and that's the time from the first person going through the line to the last person going through the line, or plated, meaning the last person receives their plate of food after about 30 minutes to 45 minutes. At this point is when toasts can start as people are finishing up their meals, or maybe getting seconds if that's an option, so that right about at an hour, we're done with the seated portion and the meal portion of the wedding, and we're moving on to the next thing. Any longer than that, your guests are going to get antsy, they're going to be waiting for the next thing, there's this weird lull time, and you want to keep the momentum of the evening going. So you don't want to have a super long dinner time, especially if that means you have your first group of guests getting their food right away, and potentially an hour or an hour and a half later, the rest of the group is getting their meal. So that is something that tends to be tricky with food trucks. When you think about it, food trucks started as a mobile option for a restaurant, and typically they're seen at things like farmers markets, at like craft fairs, events that people are leisurely attending and not really dealing with too much of a timing situation. So on a Saturday afternoon, if you're waiting in line for a food truck to get some food, waiting 10-15 minutes is not that big of a deal, and likely you won't have 150 people waiting behind you as well. At a wedding, you're going to want to be able to crank out these meals as quickly as possible, and waiting for 10-15 minutes for a meal is just not going to cut it when you have potentially 150 people also waiting. So talk to food trucks, have this conversation with them, and make sure that A, they have done weddings before, B, ask them how long that they can, or how quickly they can serve guests. So a good question to ask is, how many people can you serve in a 30-minute span? So if they can serve, ideally you want the answer to be at least 100, but then you have to think about how many guests you're inviting. So if you're inviting over 100, if you're inviting 150, 200 people, and they can serve 100 per 30 minutes, and you have over 200, that's over an hour that people are going to be waiting to get food, and over an hour that you have to wait to move on to the next item on your agenda. So if you're having guests over like 125 people, honestly, I wouldn't even consider using food trucks. I think at that point it's going to be a lot more time than you will want to spend. It's not as cost efficient, and there's just a lot more details and just more negatives than positives, in my honest opinion. However, if you do have under that guest count, food trucks can still be an option for you. And there are ways to improve the timing and just have those conversations in the planning process so that you're not stuck with a difficult situation on your wedding day. So when it comes to the timing, something that helps is to talk with the food truck about limiting their menu. So you don't want to offer the full menu at your wedding. You don't want the food truck to just roll up and operate as normal. You want to limit that to maybe 3 options so that your guests have a smaller menu to choose from. This cuts down on the time of people like having to stand in line and decide what they want to eat. And this also helps with the inventory that the food truck will be able to have, because when you think about it, a food truck can really only bring the amount of food that can fit in the truck. So you've got to think about portions for every person and how much food that they are actually capable of bringing, and that is going to be limited based on the number of guests that you have at your wedding. So having a limited number of options is a great way to keep the cost down there and also keep timing more efficient. A good idea to do as well is to have some sort of like printed menu that guests can see before getting in line. And I mentioned this in the previous video as well, but I have done like meal cards. So you'll have a printed menu so that guests know what the options are going to be at their table setting before they go and get their food. And so that cuts down on the deciding time. And then also you can do an option where guests can check off what they want to eat, and that way all they have to do is hand it over to whoever's operating the food truck, and that will go a lot quicker, so they're not having to stand and have that conversation with them. Any extra options, toppings, whatever it might be, you can just mark all those down, and that's a very quick and efficient way to take somebody's order. It's also great, you can put your name on it, and that way when your food is ready, they can just call your name and you go up and grab your food, and it's just like a nice, efficient way to do this. The next thing you want to think through is, what is the food going to be served on? This is a little detail that's often overlooked, and typically, with a catering service, they can often provide the china and the flatware and the glasses and everything that you will need for dinner service, or oftentimes the venue even provides that as well. With a food truck, this isn't really an option for you. Most food trucks operate with disposable plates, and if that's something that bothers you, or if you're wanting to have a more stylized table setting and have actual china on the tables, then you will need to use a third-party rental, most likely. Now, the thing about this is, when you are bringing in rentals from a third party, that means that you have to get them back to that third party at the end of the night or the next day or whenever it might be. This also means that they have to be cleaned and washed on site. And if you're using a food truck, you're not going to have the wait staff and the bussers that are necessary to do this, which means it will fall on you. So this is a very important thing to consider if you do want to have an option other than disposable plates. And also just with food trucks in general, that's something to note, that when you're hiring food trucks as a catering service, you don't have the wait staff that you would with another catering service to go through and bus your tables. And so this will be pre-busting while dinner is still going on, and then at the end of the night, completely clearing all the tables, scraping the dishes, either washing them or packing them up to be washed and taken out off-site that day. An option here would be to rent something like a charger so that you can still have that nice table setting and still have the element of this uniform look, and have it look a little bit nicer than just using disposable plates. And guests can go up to the food truck, get their disposable plate that the food trucks are providing with the meal, and bring it back to their table. And that way for photos, you still have photos, and when guests walk into the reception space, there's still a nice table setting and it looks really nice and uniform, but you're not having to deal with the aftermath of what that means to rent china through a third party. With chargers, it's a lot easier to clean up. A lot of times, the plate goes on top of the charger, so there's oftentimes nothing to clean up underneath, or if it is, it's very quick and easy, and that's a lot easier to pack up and send off to either have it picked up or to deliver it yourself back to the rental company the next day. This also goes for flatware or silverware. Disposable silverware is obviously a lot easier. Guests will just toss their plate and their silverware at the end of the night, and there won't be any busting to do at the end of the night, so that's a huge pro of using disposable silverware. However, again, if you are wanting to have a nicer look, or if you're wanting to be a little bit more eco-friendly and use actual real flatware. Again, you can rent it through a third party, and with flatware it's a little bit easier to clean up and manage than it is with plates. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you still want it to have a nicer look and a more finished table setting, you can still opt for actual flatware. Just keep in mind, you'll have to be the one to clean it up at the end of the night, or designate somebody to do so. Now, when it comes to the actual trucks, you do have a lot of options here depending on your area, and if you wanted to have multiple trucks, that is something that people do as well. I will say though, you want to limit your options. Like I mentioned before, the less options, the better for efficiency's sake. So if you're having 150 guests or 125 guests, and you want to give them a couple options, I would say no more than 3 food trucks. Typically 2 to 3, if you're doing more than one, 2 to 3 is the best number. This way you're giving them some options. This can also help with efficiency, so you have multiple lines to go through so that not everyone is waiting on one food truck to be able to pump out the food. But then you're not giving too many options to where guests don't know where to go, and also you have to consider cost. The more food trucks you hire, that's obviously the more food that you have to pay for, because without some sort of plated meal RSVP situation like you have with other caterers, there's no way to really know what your guests are going to want to eat prior to the wedding day, unless you have a good idea of what your guest count is, or your guest list is, and like what they enjoy eating, which is difficult to know. So without that knowledge ahead of time, there's not really any way to know of how much food of each truck you're going to need to provide. So you will need enough to feed your guest list at each food truck, or at least 70% of your guests at each food truck. So the more food trucks you have, the more food you're paying for, the more staff you're paying for, you get it. I think food trucks are a super fun thing to have at your wedding. It makes it a little bit more casual, makes it more interactive, and it's a way to express more of your personality, and you have a little bit more say over the type of food that you can provide at your wedding. So food trucks are a great wedding catering style. You just want to make sure that it's the right style for you, checks all of your boxes, and that it will work for your venue, your guest count, your budget, and every other little piece of the puzzle. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to get weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice, and we'll see you next week.